In the year 850 before Christ, an unarmed man defeated an entire army without shedding a single drop of blood. What that man saw that morning in the mountains of Dothan would forever change our understanding of what is truly possible. The palace of Ben-Hadad II, king of Syria, burned with a restrained fury. For the third consecutive time, his most secret military plans had been discovered. Perfectly coordinated ambushes were turning into death traps for his own troops. Night movements planned weeks in advance ended in inexplicable disasters. His generals looked at each other with suspicion. Someone was betraying the most powerful empire in the region. "There is a traitor among us!" the monarch roared, his eyes scanning every face in the throne room. "Someone is selling our secrets to the king of Israel." The silence was deafening. Each commander evaluated his colleagues, each advisor suspected the other. The Syrian Empire, which had conquered entire cities, was beginning to crumble from within through paranoia. Then, one of his most loyal officers stepped forward with a revelation that seemed impossible. "My lord, it is none of us. It is the prophet of Israel, Elisha. They say he knows even the words your majesty speaks in the privacy of your own bedroom." Ben-Hadad stood motionless. It wasn't a human traitor. It was something far more dangerous, a man who could see the invisible, hear the inaudible, and know the unknowable. "Where is this man?" the king asked, his voice now containing something more than fury. It contained fear. "In Dothan, my lord. A small city without significant walls, vulnerable." The Syrian king's smile was like the edge of a sword. If intelligence could not be protected, the source of the leak had to be eliminated. That same night, as the stars shone over the wilderness of Samaria, an army set out. This was no ordinary troop. Ben-Hadad had sent a massive force, war horses, chariots, elite soldiers. The gleam of bronze and iron from thousands of weapons reflected the torchlight. The ground trembled under the weight of the most advanced war machinery of its time. Their mission was singular: to capture or eliminate one unarmed elderly prophet. The march was silent, calculated, perfect. They surrounded the small city of Dothan like a serpent of metal and muscle. By the time the sun began to rise over the hills of Samaria, Elisha was completely encircled. And then the world changed. Elisha's servant, a young man whose name the scriptures preserved as Gehazi, awoke with the first ray of light. He stepped out of the prophet's modest house to begin his daily tasks. What he saw paralyzed him. From every angle, as far as the eye could see, a sea of soldiers, horses, and chariots completely surrounded the city. The reflection of the rising sun on the armor created a blinding glare. It was a demonstration of absolute power, a declaration of war against two people. The young man ran back, his heart pounding like a war drum. "Master! Alas, my master! What shall we do?" His voice trembled. The mathematics of despair were simple and brutal. Thousands of trained warriors against an old man and his assistant. No, there was no escape. There was no tactic. There was no hope. But Elisha, sitting in the stillness of the morning, showed not even a hint of fear. "Don't be afraid," the prophet said with a calm that defied all logic. His eyes, wrinkled by decades of experience, shone with a knowledge that transcended the visible. And then he spoke words that have resonated through the centuries: "For those who are with us are more than those who are with them." The servant looked at his master as if he had lost his mind. More? Where? Did the prophet not see the ocean of metal and death surrounding them? Elisha did not argue. He did not explain. He simply prayed. "Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see." And at that moment, the veil between two worlds was torn. The young servant blinked. Something had changed in the air, in the light, in the very texture of reality. And when he looked back toward the mountains surrounding Dothan, what he saw tore a gasp from his throat. The mountain was full, completely full, but not with Syrian soldiers, with something infinitely more powerful, horses of fire, chariots of fire, a celestial army that outnumbered and outshone any earthly force in majesty. The creatures were impossible to describe with human words. They burned without being consumed. They glowed without blinding. Their forms were solid yet ethereal, present yet belonging to another dimension of existence. The chariots did not rest on wheels, but on flames that did not scorch the earth. The horses breathed light, and every movement left trails of golden radiance in the air. They were not randomly arranged. They formed a perfect defensive perimeter, every angle covered, every point of access protected. The Syrian army, with all its brute strength, was completely surrounded by a force operating according to laws they could not even perceive. The servant fell to his knees, not out of fear, but out of absolute awe. Now he understood Elisha's calm. The prophet did not live in denial of reality. He lived in a broader reality, where the invisible was as real, more real than the visible. Elisha had seen these creatures before. Years ago, when his master Elijah was taken to heaven, chariots of fire descended from the firmament. For the prophet, this spiritual world was not a theological theory. It was as familiar as the dawn. As the servant gazed in wonder at the celestial army below in the valley, the Syrian army began its advance. The commanders gave the orders. The elite soldiers prepared themselves. This would be a swift and brutal assault. Capture the prophet before noon, take him in chains to Ben-Hadad, and restore control over military intelligence. They marched with military precision toward the defenseless city. And then Elisha prayed for a second time. But this time he did not ask for eyes to be opened. He asked for exactly the opposite. I pray you, Lord, strike this people with blindness. What happened next defies all rational explanation. The soldiers continued to advance, but something fundamental had changed. Their eyes functioned perfectly. Their pupils responded to light. Their optic nerves transmitted signals to the brain, but the interpretation of those signals was completely distorted. They did not see darkness. They saw incorrectly. Roads became confused, directions were reversed. The city of Dothan, which they had surrounded with military precision just minutes before, suddenly seemed to be elsewhere. The spatial coordinates their brains processed did not match physical reality. It was a selective, surgical blindness. They did not lose consciousness. They did not lose their balance. They only lost the ability to navigate the world with precision. And in the midst of that total confusion, a figure appeared walking calmly toward them. The man they had come to capture approached the army that sought him, and they did not recognize him. This is not the way, nor is this the city, the prophet said, with a serene, almost kind voice. Follow me, and I will lead you to the man you seek. And then the absolutely impossible occurred. The hunters followed their prey. Thousands of trained warriors, each equipped with the best military technology of the time, walked obediently behind an unarmed old man. The Syrian army, which had marched all night to capture the prophet, now marched under his direction. Elisha led them for 19 kilometers through the territory of Samaria. There was no haste in his step. There was no tension in his posture. He walked like a shepherd leading sheep, not like a prisoner escaping captors. The soldiers followed him without question, their minds trapped in the perceptual distortion that prevented them from recognizing the brutal irony of their situation. For hours they walked. The sun climbed in the sky. The desert heat began to beat down on the bronze armor, but they kept moving forward, trusting the man they were supposed to seize. And finally, they reached their destination. The walls of Samaria rose before them, tall, thick, impenetrable. The capital of the kingdom of Israel, the heart of enemy territory. Elisha led the Syrian army directly through the open gates of the city. The astonished Israelite guards watched as thousands of enemy soldiers entered their capital peacefully, following an elderly prophet like children following a teacher. Once the last Syrian soldier had crossed the gates, Elisha prayed for the third time, "Lord, now open the eyes of these men so they may see." And reality returned like a hammer. The eyes of thousands of Syrian soldiers blinked. The perceptual fog that had clouded their minds dissipated like smoke in the wind. And then they understood. They were inside Samaria, surrounded by enemy walls. The city gates had closed behind them. Above, on the battlements, Israelite archers aimed their arrows downward. Soldiers with drawn swords surrounded them on all sides. A deadly silence fell over the Syrian army. The commanders looked around with growing horror. They had come to capture a man, and now they were the captured. They had planned an arrest, and now they expected a mass execution. The king of Israel descended from his palace with a wild smile on his face. Never in the history of the wars between Syria and Israel had he held such an advantage. Thousands of elite enemy soldiers, completely stripped of their will, delivered like lambs for the slaughter. He approached Elisha, his eyes gleaming with vengeful anticipation. "Shall I kill them, my father? Shall I kill them?" The question echoed through the air. The Syrian soldiers held their breath. They knew the answer would determine whether they would see another dawn. For decades, Syria and Israel had shed each other's blood. Endless battles, cruel ambushes, besieged cities, destroyed families. Now, finally, Israel had the chance to crush its enemy in one fell swoop. All that was needed was one word from Elisha. The prophet looked at the king. His ancient eyes held a wisdom that no military strategist could comprehend. "Do not kill them," he said simply. The king blinked, confused. "What? Do not kill them. Would you kill those you took captive with your sword and your bow? No, set food and water before them, let them eat and drink, and let them go back to their master." The silence that followed was so thick it could be cut with a knife. The Israelite generals looked at each other, incredulous. The Syrian soldiers could not comprehend what they had just heard. The king of Israel opened his mouth to protest, but something in Elisha's expression stopped him. This was not a gesture of weakness. It was something much deeper, much more calculated, much more powerful than any military victory. And then, the strangest banquet in ancient history began. Orders flowed from the royal palace. Bring bread, bring meat, bring fresh water from the wells, prepare the tables. The army that came to kill would be fed by those they came to kill. The Syrian soldiers, still processing their impossible situation, sat down slowly. At first, no one ate. The distrust was palpable. Was this psychological torture before execution, an elegant poison? But Elisha himself served the commanders. The prophet they had come to capture offered them bread with his own hands, and then, slowly, they began to eat. What happened at that banquet transformed more than empty stomachs. As the Syrian soldiers consumed the Israelite food, something fundamental changed in their perception. They had not only seen an army of fire that morning in Dothan, they had experienced their own total vulnerability. They had been led like blind men by the man they came to destroy. They had been completely at the mercy of their enemies and had received mercy instead of death. Every bite of bread was a reminder. Every sip of water was a lesson. Real power did not reside in swords or war chariots. It resided in something that transcended brute force. The Syrian commanders ate in silence, their minds processing the deepest humiliation a warrior can experience, being forgiven by those who should hate you. The banquet lasted for hours. There were no speeches, there were no terms of surrender, there were no formal treaties, just food shared between enemies, an act so simple and so revolutionary that it defied all the logic of war. When the sun began to descend toward the horizon, Elisha stood up. "Now," he said with the same unwavering calm he had shown since dawn, "return to your master." The gates of Samaria opened. The Syrian soldiers, fed and confused, began to file out. No Israelite followed them. No arrow was fired at their backs. No ambush waited on the road. They were simply set free. The march back to Syria was completely different from the march of arrival. They had come with military arrogance and certainty in their superiority. They returned with something that no combat training could provide: humility forced by the supernatural. When the commanders arrived at Ben-Hadad's palace and reported what had happened, the Syrian king remained silent for a long time. There were no punishments. There were no recriminations. How could you blame your soldiers for being victims of the impossible? Ben-Hadad understood something that would change the course of history. There were forces operating in this conflict that his armies could not fight, strategies that his generals could not counter, a power that his war chariots could not conquer, and the scriptures record with astonishing simplicity. And the bands of Syria came no more into the land of Israel. Decades of war, generations of conflict, endless cycles of revenge and counterattack, all ended not by a decisive battle, but by an unexpected banquet. The sword had failed where bread had succeeded. But the story does not end with peace treaties. It ends with a question that resonates through the millennia. What did Elisha's servant really see that morning in the mountains of Dothan? It was not a hallucination. It was not poetic symbolism. The scriptures are clear. There was a real army operating according to real laws, in a dimension of reality that normally remains invisible to human eyes. The horses of fire were not metaphors. The celestial chariots were not literary figures. They were as tangible as the Syrian soldiers, only they operated on a frequency of existence that required spiritual perception to be detected. And here is the most unsettling revelation. That army is still there. It was not summoned specifically for that morning and then dissolved. It was not an emergency resource that appeared and disappeared. It is a constant presence, operating continuously in a layer of reality that most of humanity never perceives. Elisha did not create that protection with his prayer. He simply opened his servant's eyes to see what had always been there. This is the truth that makes this story more than an ancient tale. We live in a multi-layered universe. What we see with our physical eyes is only an infinitesimal fraction of what truly exists. The forces that shape historical events are not always visible in news headlines or troop movements. The Syrian army saw only soldiers, weapons, and tactics. Elisha saw a completely different game board where the true battles were fought in dimensions that the generals did not even know existed. And he won without fighting. That is the absolute reversal. Supreme power demonstrated through the absence of violence. When Ben-Hadad sent thousands of warriors, he thought he was demonstrating strength. In reality, he was exposing his fundamental weakness, the belief that visible reality was the only reality that mattered. When Elisha fed his captors instead of executing them, onlookers thought he was being soft. In reality, he was exercising a power so absolute that he could afford mercy as a strategy. The lesson is not simply be kind to your enemies. The lesson is much deeper. Those who can see beyond the obvious operate with advantages that others cannot even imagine. Elisha's servant saw what we can all see if our eyes are opened, that every impossible situation already contains its own solution, operating on a frequency that requires expanded perception to detect. The army of fire did not descend because Elisha prayed. It was there all along. The prayer only changed who could see it. And here is the final question that this ancient story poses to every person who hears it. What invisible armies surround your life right now? What protections operate in dimensions that your physical eyes cannot detect? What resources are available to you in layers of reality that you have not yet learned to perceive? The prophet of Dothan was not special because he had access to supernatural power. He was special because he recognized that supernatural power was the true structure of reality. and the physical world was only its shadow. That is why he could say with perfect calm, while thousands of warriors surrounded his house, "Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." He was not in denial. He was in a broader reality. And that army of fire, those celestial forces that operate beyond the veil of the visible, still stand guard over those whose eyes have been opened to see them. The Battle of Dothan was never about soldiers against prophets. It was about two completely different ways of seeing the universe, and the broader vision won without shedding a single drop of blood. That is the impossible victory. That is the eternal revelation. That is the truth that changes everything. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them. They always have been.